Well, welcome to, having said that, I've now moved back. So. You have to have it quite close to your voice. Anyway, welcome to this afternoon's session. My name is Dharmakarunya, and this is my chapter buddy, my friend Prasadashila, and we're going to be co-leading this afternoon's session. And we're going to be leading it on a very beloved text in the canon, which is called Pingiya's Praises. Now, I imagine that some of you know it, and some of you don't. Is that fair? A fair sort of assumption? That's good. No prior knowledge is required, so you don't need to worry about that. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the text to start us off. And then after that, Prasadashila is going to give a short, very short talk on what the text means to her, okay? And then we're going to have the opportunity to have a little bit of time in groups. So I've got some questions for you to sort of think about in the groups. And then the last part of the session will be a led meditation, which is a visualization of the Buddha. So that's what the afternoon looks like. Okay. So just begin by giving a little bit of context to the teaching that we're going to be looking at this afternoon. So it's familiarly known as Pingiya's Praises. Pingiya's Praises, and it comes from one of the oldest parts of the Pali Canon. And the Pali Canon is the original sort of canon of earliest teachings from the Buddha. Okay, so it's back. Obviously, the Buddha lived 2,500 years ago. So we're not, and in an oral society, not a written society, but nonetheless, the Pali Canon is the earliest record of the Buddha's teachings. And so Pingiya's Praises is a text that comes from this very early collection of teachings. And Pingiya's section comes at the end of the final chapter of the Sutta Nipata, and it's called The Way to the Beyond. Now, the chapter, just give you a little bit of an overview to locate the teaching. The chapter itself is made up of a set of 16 questions. Okay, 16 questions which 16 Brahmins bring to the Buddha. So, I don't know about you, but when I first started coming to the Buddhist Centre, I had loads of questions. Lots and lots of questions. I was probably quite an irritating person at the back of the class. But yes, we have questions, don't we, about the spiritual life, because certainly maybe at the beginning of our encounter with meditation, with Buddhism, we kind of want to know, and it's in a way, it's a bit of a kind of new territory for us, so we have lots of questions. So these questions, these 16 questions, were brought by 16 Brahmins. So Brahmins are, in essence, very, very experienced teachers, you could say. They're ascetic, so they're living a spiritual life, okay? And I think in ancient sort of Hindu history, they were seen as guardians of the Vedic texts. But essentially, for our purposes, they're very experienced teachers, okay? So these very experienced teachers came to the Buddha and wanted to ask him a whole range of different questions about different areas of practice, in the same way that you or I might have questions about practice. You might, when you're new to meditation, you might say, well, how long do I need to meditate for to have any effect? Or if you're a much more experienced person, you might have a much more detailed question about Buddhist scriptures or particular meditation practices. So we all have our questions, and these Brahmins, experienced teachers, were no exception. And most of them had travelled a very, very long way. Apparently, I mean, who knows in terms of accuracy, but apparently they'd travelled over 1,000 miles to ask the Buddha these questions. And among these 16 people who'd come to see the Buddha, among the questioners anyway, were two people called Brahmin Bhavari and Brahmin Pingiya. Now, interestingly, Brahmin Bhavari and Brahmin Pingiya were actually very old and quite frail to make the journey to see the Buddha. So Bhavari sends his disciples, so he's such a well-known teacher, he sends his disciples the way you do. Well, I don't, but he sends his disciples to ask the Buddha questions on his behalf, okay? Pingiya similarly is too old or too frail to go and see the Buddha. So these things are important to bear in mind. And they're important because already, I mean, quite often, if you look at the Buddhist teachings, you've got the Buddha being asked a question from the person in front of him, and he's responding. Here, it's kind of a bit different, because what we've got is two people who are very established teachers in their own right, who aren't able to go and see him, and there's no email, obviously, or WhatsApp. I guess the Buddha didn't use WhatsApp anyway, but it's important because what I'm saying about this is the transmission of the teaching from the Buddha to the questioner is already happening outside of real time and real space, okay? And this is very important for the teachings that we're going to be looking at. And also I think it's important because in a way it mirrors our situation. Because we have, whether you've just happened across the Buddhist Centre last week, okay, or whether you've been coming to the Buddhist Centre for decades and have got a very established Buddhist practice, we are in this situation, aren't we? We're in the situation of not being able to have a direct transmission from the Buddha in front of us. Robin, I hope you don't mind standing for the Buddha. Okay, no pressure. But we haven't got the Buddha in front of us, okay? We have archetypes of the Buddha, we have representations of the Buddha, but we don't have the literal being in front of us. So our position, in a way, is sort of fairly similar, not exactly similar, but fairly similar to the situation of these two figures which are going to be important to us later this afternoon, Brahmin Bhavari and Brahmin Pingiya. So in approaching this encounter between the Buddha and Pingiya and Bhavari, one thing that we need to do is we need to begin to let go of the literal mind and open our minds and our hearts to the realms of imagination and faith. And I think often in the blurb that I wrote for this session this afternoon, I talked about how do we keep our connection with the Buddha alive? Because the Buddha isn't literally with us anymore in that direct materialistic way. And I think in conventional reality, we inevitably, life is fast, life is busy, and we tend to prioritise both the materialist and a utilitarian perspective in our lives, because we kind of have to. It's a practical necessity a lot of the time. But what happens, I think, often is that the sort of map becomes the territory. And of course the map isn't the territory is the territory, and the map is the map. So we tend to get sort of enchanted by this materialist perspective. And we tend to think that things are as they are, people are as they are, and that they they might change a bit, but not very much, and that our reality is largely stable and solid and unchanging. And I think as we start to deepen our spiritual practice, and we spend maybe more time at the Buddhist Center, and we become more exposed to the Buddha's teaching, we sort of start to loosen that perspective, that sort of strictly materialist perspective. And we begin to intuit and imagine different levels and layers of reality beyond this strictly materialist perspective. Now, Pingiya, he's a Brahmin, he's got a question. So he comes to the Buddha and he has a question. Okay, we're going to read the text in a minute, just in case you're thinking, what is he actually saying? We're going to read it in a minute. So Pingiya's question, okay, is, the whole range of questions that the Brahmins ask are very, very varied. And it's a very big sort of chapter, really, in that sense. But Pingiya's question, in my opinion, is a, or maybe the, fundamental question of spiritual practice. And the question is, how do I go beyond birth and death? How do I go beyond birth and death? Now, an initial answer to that question from a Dharmic perspective would be, well, how do I go beyond birth and death? Well, the clue is in the eye. The clue is in the eye. But I think there's a much richer answer. I mean, that's already a pretty rich answer, but there's a much richer answer. And the clue is in the eye because spiritual practice, whether we're Buddhists or we identify as Buddhists, or whether we identify as Hindu or Christian or Jewish or whatever our faith tradition, spiritual practice tends to be about an altruistic dimension, developing an altruistic dimension. And an altruistic dimension requires that we go beyond the eye, okay? And in the teaching of the three fetters, or the three lots of obstacles to the spiritual life, but these three, one of them is this sense of having an eye or a personality view. It's the first fetter, okay? That we believe ourselves and our personality to be absolutely solid, okay? So that's why I'm suggesting a bit facetiously that the clue is in the eye. But I think there's a much bigger answer to the question, as we'll see. And yeah, as we'll read the text in a minute, but the Buddha offers Pingiya and Barbary, because Pingiya is relating the teachings to Barbary, several teachings which encapsulate a lot of Dharma. So I'm going to sort of flag them, and it might be a list that flows past you and over your head. Don't worry about that, but I just thought it would be helpful to signal them, yeah? And then what we're going to do is we'll read the text, okay? So you've got a handle on the text. So, yeah, so the Buddha offers Pingiya and Barbary several teachings. And I think the first one is letting go of the body and forms. Letting go of the body and forms. So all the things, well, to put it in a very sort of shorthand way, everything that we take to be solid, including our own bodies, everything that we take to be solid and enduring and permanent, we need to hold them with a much lighter perspective. Okay? It doesn't mean they don't exist at all, but it means that they exist in a different kind of way to the way that we thought they existed. Yeah? So holding the body and forms lightly and ultimately letting go of them. The second one is letting go. This is a very common teaching in the Dharma, isn't it? Letting go of desire and craving. Okay, letting go. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't need to get out of bed in the morning. Yeah, so we do need to have purpose and do things. And what it's really getting at here is letting go of neurotic desire and craving. It's not saying that anything that you think is a good idea to do is a bad idea because it involves desire and craving. We need skillful desire. Yeah. So letting go of desire and craving. And then lastly, he suggests to Pingiya that he cultivates Shraddha. So Shraddha sometimes is described as faith, but a more accurate version of Shraddha is confidence and trust in our practice. Yes? And it's often translated as where we place our heart. Okay, now that language might not resonate with everybody. So it might need a translation for you. So I'm not quite sure what the translation would be for you if that one doesn't work. But you might think about, well, what really resonates in your gut? Yeah, what really sort of fires you up? What's part of your personal myth? What really kind of is meaningful to you and the values that you hold? Okay. So that's a snapshot of the teachings that the Buddha is offering Pingiya, as we'll come on to see. But it doesn't end there, because Pingiya, he's known as Pingiya the Wise, by the way, so he's a very wise person, offers us further teachings which we can practice. And you'll see when we read it that these are sort of scattered through what he says. And the first one is practice mindfulness. Practice mindfulness. Now, even if you've not been coming to the Buddha Center very long, you've probably had a go at that already. Yeah? Practice mindfulness, or sati as it's known. So practice mindfulness, and also practice vigilance, which is known as apramada. Okay, so it's just like being aware of what you're doing and being aware of your purpose, your spiritual purpose. That's what apramada is all about. Yeah. So it's kind of slowly developing a purpose for your practice. Second one is, and it's what Pingiya does, is bringing the Buddha to mind very regularly. Yes? And we'll be doing a bit of that later on. So bringing the Buddha to mind very regularly. Third one is purposeful thought, or chaitana as it's known, purposeful thought. So how do we develop purposeful thought? Well, some of that it's about having maybe a regular meditation practice, and also knowing what we're doing when we're doing it. Yeah, I think that's what he's getting at here. So spiritual intentions, spiritual volitions, and a couple more. Okay, and then we'll read the text. So number 4 is letting go of comparisons. Somebody, I can't remember who said this, but it's often quoted that comparison is the thief of joy. It's nice, isn't it? Comparison is the thief of joy. So let go of comparisons. Each of us, whether you've just started coming to the Buddha Center or whether you've been coming for decades, each of us is on our own path. And each of us will be working with particular things in a particular set of circumstances. So, yeah, sometimes it's great to have spiritual friends. It's really good to have spiritual friends that we can share our practice with. But it doesn't tend to be that helpful to get into comparisons, yeah? Because the path is made for us alone. That's not to say that there aren't commonalities. There are commonalities. But yes, in the society that we're in, this kind of comparative aspect is very, very strong. So we kind of need to let that go a little bit and begin, because I think unless we let comparison go, we can't trust ourselves. We can't develop that faith dimension, which is very important. Yeah? And then lastly, letting go of skeptical doubt, okay, which is another of the fetters, the three fetters. So there are different types of doubt, and the one that is particularly corrosive and unhelpful is skeptical doubt. It's good to question the teachings. In fact, that's what the Buddha tells us to do all the time. Yeah? But it's very important to distinguish between the different types of doubt that we might be experiencing. Yeah? So test the teachings, okay, but maybe we need to try and avoid letting that tip into a kind of corrosiveness that is actually very undermining of anything we're trying to do in the spiritual life. So, so Pingiya and Bhavri, as well as the other Brahmins, are very powerful examples of spiritual teachers who exhort us, who encourage us by their example to trust the Buddha, the luminosity and omniscience of the enlightened mind. And it's an enlightened mind it's in the enlightened mind because it has none of what are termed the root poisons of greed, hatred and delusion. Yeah, so it's, Pingiya I think is a very powerful example of encouraging us to trust these teachings and trust the enlightened mind, yeah? And cultivate a relationship to the enlightened mind. Now, I'll say maybe a little bit more about what that means really later, but we don't need to be perfect. In fact, I was coming across a talk by Sadhanandi recently, who's a very experienced order member at Adhisthana, who talked about the idea of perfection as a kind of delusion, really, because perfection is impossible. To be human is to be, well, partly a bit of a mess, but it's also to be a kind of evolving story of making our way in the world, and we make our way by trial and error. So we don't need to be perfect, and actually, it's probably a red herring anyway. But all we're really aspiring to, on the spiritual path in Buddhism, is to see things as they are. That's what we're aspiring to. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, so we don't run out of time. Prasadashila and I are going to sort of read the text now. So I'm just going to read the opening section, and then we'll move into Pingiya's praises. So the first section is Pingiya's question. Then the Brahmin Pingiya spoke. I am old and decaying. My body is weak and my skin is pale. I can hardly see, and I only hear with difficulty. Don't let me die while I'm still in confusion, but teach me about the way things are, so that I shall know how to leave birth and aging behind me. Look, replied the Buddha. Look, how many people are tormented by pain. Look how careless they are, and how greatly they suffer because of body and forms. If you don't want to go on and on becoming Pingiya, you must let go of the body and the forms. In all the 10 directions, said Pingiya, above, below, and in every quarter of the compass, there is not a thing that you have not heard, seen, known, or understood. Teach me about the way things are, so that I shall know how to leave birth and aging behind me. Can you see, replied the Buddha, how people are oppressed by desire? Can you see how they're racked and worn by aging? If you don't want to go on and on becoming Pingiya, you must let go of craving.
I will sing you, can you hear that? I will sing you the praises of the way to the beyond, said Pingiya, when he returned to where the Brahmin Bhavari lives on the banks of the river Godavari. It was described to us by this man exactly as he saw it. But then there isn't any reason why a man like him, should lie, a man of knowledge and completely pure, a man without desire. When a voice has none of the glibness of pride and none of the ingrained stains of ignorance, then its words are full of sweetness and beauty. It is such words that I praise now. They call him Buddha, enlightened, awake, dissolving darkness, with total vision and knowing the world to its ends. He has gone beyond all the states of being and of becoming. He has no inner poison drives. He is the total elimination of suffering. This man, Brahmin Bhavari, is the man that I follow. It is like a bird that leaves the bushes of the scrubland and flies to the fruit trees of the forest. I too have left the bleary half-light of opinions, and like a swan, I have reached a great lake. Up till now, before I heard Gautama's teaching, people had always told me, this is the way it is. This is how it has always been, and this is how it will always be. Only the constant refrain of tradition, a breeding ground for speculation. This prince, this beam of light, Gautama, was the only one who dissolved the darkness. This man Gautama is a universe of wisdom and a world of understanding. A teacher whose Dharma is the way things are, instant, immediate, and visible all around, eroding desire without harmful side effects, with nothing else quite like it anywhere in the world.
But Pingiya, said Bhavari, why then don't you spend all your time, your every moment with this man Gautama, this universe of wisdom, this world of understanding, this teacher whose Dharma is the way things are, instant, immediate, and visible all around, eroding desire without harmful side effects, and with nothing else quite like it anywhere in the world?
Brahmin, sir, there is no moment for me, however small, that is spent away from Gautama, from this universe of wisdom, this world of understanding. This teacher, whose teaching is the way things are, instant, immediate, and visible all around, eroding desire without harmful side effects, with nothing else quite like it anywhere in the world. You see, sir, with constant and careful vigilance, it is possible for me to see him with my mind as clearly as with my eyes, in night as well as day. And since I spend my nights revering him, there is not, to my mind, a single moment spent away from him. I cannot now move away from the teaching of Gautama. The powers of confidence and joy, of intellect and awareness hold me there. Whichever way this universe of wisdom goes, it draws me with it. Physically, I cannot move like that. My body is decaying. I am old and weak. But the driving power of purposeful thought propels me with it without break. There was a time when, writhing in the mud of the swamps, I could only drift from one stone to the next. But then I saw the Sambuddha, fully awake and free from defilement.
Then the Buddha spoke. Pingiya, he said, other people have freed themselves by the power of confidence. Vakali, Bhadravinya, and Alavi Gautama have all done this. You too should let that strength release you. You too will go to the further shore beyond the draw of death.
These words, said Pingiya, are the words of a man of wisdom. As I hear them, I become more confident. This man is Sambuddha. He has opened the curtains and woken up. There is nothing barren there. His mind is clear and luminous. Everything accessible to knowledge is known to him, even the ultimate subtleties of Godhood. There are no more questions for the doubtful who come to him. The teacher has answered them all. Yes, I shall go there. I shall go beyond change. I shall go beyond formations. I shall go beyond comparison. There are no more doubts. You may consider this as mind released.
Okay, it's a very powerful text, at least for me it is, every time I hear it. So I'm going to hand back now to Prasadashila, who very kindly offered to give a very short talk about what the text means to her in her practice.
Yes, so it is a short talk, and it is quite a personal talk. So the first time that I heard these verses, it would have been at a Sangha night at the Liverpool Centre that I went to and still go to. And the teacher there, Buddha Shanti, was obviously giving one of his regular talks. It was very early years of my involvement with Buddhism and Sri Ratna, and it's probably about 20 years ago. I do remember, even then, that they did make some impression on me, probably something to do with the depth of feeling that they convey. I do think the memory of them faded quite quickly though. But the next time I heard them, it felt to me like I was meeting a friend that I hadn't seen for a long time. It was like I knew them well, but had forgotten just how important they were. And I think after hearing them that time, I did go home and looked up this text that we're talking about. And I made a copy of Pingiya's praises. And I think I've had that copy quite close to hand ever since, for the last 20 odd years. It does disappear. I have mounds of paper, loads of filing that I've kept over the years, and this actual copy might disappear. But I do know that when it comes to mind, or if I want it for anything, I can find it again without too much trouble. So it's never very far away from me. So what is it about these verses that do make such an impression on me? So I think for me, it's words. Words in general are one of my greatest sources of inspiration. They do say that a picture paints 1,000 words, but actually give me the words any day. A picture by its very nature has to be a physical representation of its subject. And although I know that good artists can inject a lot of feeling and a lot of emotion into pictures, I've come to realise that for me, descriptions of physical attributes are hard for me to get excited about. I find it very difficult to transform descriptions into an actual picture in my head. I can sometimes get a sense of what they're trying to convey, but not a really clear picture. I find if I'm reading a novel and it goes off into a section of description, maybe, scenery or a person even, But if they start going into detail, I find myself skimming over the words with no sense of the picture at all. And the section becomes, for me, just words that don't mean very much. And I must admit that I have this problem with the Mahayana Sutras. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Mahayana Sutras, but they do tend to go into an awful lot of description, especially about the Pure Lands. And I find myself just wanting to cut to the chase and get to the interesting bits. So reading Mahayana Sutras is still very much a work in progress for me. So it's not so much descriptive words that make an impression on me, but words that have the ability to move me, words that have passion in them, words that convey what the speaker is feeling. These are the words that resonate with me, and I can physically feel what I think the speaker is trying to convey. So getting back to Pingiya, we might notice that he doesn't describe the Buddha physically at all. He doesn't talk about how old or young he was, or how tall or short he might have been. The only physical attribute of the Buddha that he mentions is his voice. When a voice has none of the glibness of pride and none of the ingrained stains of ignorance, then its words are full of sweetness and beauty. So I may not be able to picture the scene, but I can hear that voice. I can hear the sincerity in it, and I can hear the kindness in it. It is such words that I praise now, says Pingiya. But then he goes back to talk some more about Buddha. So I have wondered in the past what actually is meant here by the way to the beyond. So in preparing for this talk, I listened to several talks on Pre-Buddhist audio about these verses. And in one of them, the speaker suggests that the way to the beyond could be interpreted as the fourth noble truth, the truth of the way leading to the end of suffering. And the Buddha's teaching actually of the Noble Eightfold Path. And I realised that this is the way that I initially interpreted it, that the way to the beyond was the Buddha's teaching. But that never felt totally satisfactory, because although Pingiya does talk enthusiastically about the effect the Buddha's teaching had on him, the greater part of his praise is directed towards the Buddha himself. So another of the speakers that I listened to suggested that the way to the beyond is actually the Buddha. And I realised that both of these interpretations are equally valid. If one were able to be in the presence of the Buddha, to actually spend time with him, to live with him, then I think it would quickly become apparent that there was no difference between the Buddha himself on the one hand and his teaching on the other. The Buddha was his teaching. He was the complete exemplification of what he taught. I think that just by being with him, it would be possible to absorb what the Dharma was about without him having to say anything. And this is what happened for Pingiya. He doesn't just describe the Buddha as having eliminated suffering. He says he is the total elimination of suffering. He also says he's a mammoth of knowledge, a universe of wisdom, and a world of understanding. These phrases convey so much to me without any need for pictures in my head. The verses, of course, are about the power of imagination. So I'll just say quickly here that imagination is a bit of a sticky subject for me. Because of my lack of visual imagination, I've tended to think that I lack imagination per se. But on reflection, I realised I've actually spent a good deal of my life in the world of imagination. As a child, I can remember often disappearing into my own little world and acting out whatever was going on in that world. This was a source of great amusement to my elder sisters, and so eventually became a source of embarrassment to me. My imagined worlds became more private. As I got older, imagination became a word associated with childishness and unreality. and in my mind was always preceded by a derogatory just imagination. However, that didn't stop me from indulging in daydreaming and reverie during times in my life when I wasn't particularly happy, and I could lose myself in a happier place. It was imagination under a different name. But back to Pingiya. Pingiya does have the benefit of having spent time with the Buddha, of having a living experience of him, and that experience has been so powerful that the sense of actually being with him hasn't left Pingiya, even though he spent goodness knows how long travelling back to Barbary to tell him about it. He tells Barbary that he's able to see the Buddha in his mind as clearly as if seeing him with his eyes. It does take constant and careful vigilance, but he actually finds it impossible not to do it. Finally, Pingiya says that Buddha and his Dharma have instilled such faith and joy in him that by using their power, as well as that of awareness and reason, he can actually follow the Buddha wherever it may take him. But where does all that leave me and my imagination, or lack of it? Well, I actually find that after everything I've said, I do have a picture in my head. I see a very old man, a man who after an incredibly long journey, he can possibly barely get off his bed. But this man is happy and content. He's had an amazing experience, and he's able to recall in great detail all the events of that experience. It's so real to him that he can actually hear the Buddha talking to him. And crucially, Pingiya is able to tell Barbary about that experience, and it's those words that are my inspiration. Because Pingiya's recall and imagination are so vivid, he's able to convey in wonderful words what it means to him. And those words resonate with something in me. And I'm able actually to feel something of what he felt, and so get a sense of being in the presence of the Buddha myself. That's why these verses are so important to me.
Okay, so very moving response, I think, to the text there, and it's so helpful that you talked about because we're all different, aren't we? And some of us have quite visual imaginations, and then others of us,
Some of us don't.
don't, and that's fine. And we engage with the text in all sorts of different ways. And I think it's really, really lovely to hear about your own engagement with the text. Yeah, so thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so you're going to have if you're willing, you have an opportunity now to be in a small group of, say, I don't know, we haven't counted the numbers in the room, but around 4 people, yeah? We can have a few groups in here. I think the Vajra Hall is probably free.
It's a complimentary.
Oh, is it? Okay, fine. Or if you want to go downstairs, that's fine, there'll be some space downstairs. So, I've got a few questions for you if you'd like to run with them, or if you don't want to run with them, that's fine. You can just talk about your responses to the text. But I thought it's always useful to have something to get you off the blocks, isn't it? Off the starting blocks. So the questions are, your response to the text, to the story of Pingiya, okay? That's the first area. And then the other couple of areas, excuse me, that I thought might be interesting to talk about is this story of Pingiya is a story of great wisdom, but it's also a story of great faith, or Shraddha, confidence, trust. So the question would be, what is your relationship to confidence, trust, or Shraddha, or faith, as we talk about it? Yeah. So your relationship to spiritual confidence and faith. And then, if you have time, the Buddha is, an ideal of enlightenment. Yeah. So the Buddha, as we say in the threefold puja, the Buddha was born as we were born. Yes. So the Buddha was a human being who lived 2,500 years ago, and like us, was probably a bit of a mess, And he, through his spiritual path and his quest, he became an enlightened being. So he becomes an example, an exemplar of enlightenment. So the third question, cutting to the chase, is what do we think about enlightenment? Do we believe enlightenment is for us? If so, interesting. If not, interesting. Yeah. Okay, so I make it 2:48 to be precise, so let's call it 10 to 3. So if we come back at 20